Hello, folks. Just give me 1 second so we can let Insta and TikTok in. But thank you for joining via YouTube if you were with Twitter. I guess because I'm mad, I'll call it X. That's the only circumstance in which I will call that place its adopted name. All right, we are live. Welcome back to A to Z Sports Cincinnati. I'm John Sheeran, and we are in one of the weirdest parts of the NFL offseason. That this 2-week, 3-week stretch, essentially, basically rounding out February until free agency gets here, because free agency is just the second season of the NFL calendar, and it only lasts for about a week and a half in terms of how hype it is. But undeniably, it is the busiest time of our lives, covering this beautiful game, covering your Cincinnati Bengals. I still remember before 2020, excuse me, when March was just a vacation covering the team, and it was just focusing on the draft and how all the eggs had to be in that basket to make the team better and to eventually get over the hump that they were so close to doing 4 years ago, 5 years ago. Free agency is a lot more exciting now covering the Bengals, and I expect that to be the case in 3 weeks' time when the madness begins, when the tampering window opens on March 9th, and then the league year officially begins on March 11th. If you hear my dishwasher in the background, I apologize, but that's the only distraction that we're going to have tonight. We're going to get to a topic, not a topic, but I think in general, covering this team, naturally, it gets a little negative sometimes. It's understandable. I'm sure everyone feels that way at some point. Following the Bengals, always expecting them to do something that they've never done before. In this case, either winning a Super Bowl or giving out a contract with future guarantees. That's not Joe Burrow and Jamar Chase, right? There's always this backlash that they get for not changing their ways, for not modernizing, for not sticking to the times. It can be a lot, right? And I realize that in times in which maybe you don't want to hear negative thoughts from me, right? Maybe that isn't the case, right? Maybe at some point, like you want to hear some positivity here and there. And I get that. And I'm going to do a better job of that. But for tonight, I do want to air out grievances that haven't even happened yet. I want to get through what the Bengals shouldn't do this offseason. I want to lay it all down, just get it out there so that we can document it. And in 2 months' time, after the draft comes, after free agency all happens, it all unfolds. The Bengals roster basically is what it is at that point. We can revisit this stream. We can revisit the things that we've talked about. I want to hear what you guys have to say about what you don't want the Bengals to do this offseason, because we're going to go through a free agency preview in a couple weeks' time. We're going to have a special guest for that. I can't wait to have him on. As someone that you all know very well. I'm assuming if you're a very common person in the Bengals community, we're going to get to a bunch more draft profiles. We're going to get to draft-centric videos. I'm really excited about that. We're going to get to all the things that the Bengals should do. But right now, when we're in this kind of dead period in which nothing really happens, and really, again, this is like the slowest time of the NFL calendar outside of a couple weeks in late June and July, we're just going to just air out some negatives about things that haven't even happened, but things that we're scared that are going to happen. Because those thoughts exist in every single one of your brains. I know it. They're in my brain. They've been in my brain for a long time, just knowing who this team is, how they operate. I know that people are scared. So let's just get it all out in the air right now so we can just be done with it and then move on and evaluate things when they actually do happen. So we're going to get to that in a couple minutes, but I do want to go through some things that have already happened, haven't happened, may have already happened. We'll see. But today, February 17th, is not just the birthday of Michael Jeffrey Jordan, but it is also, for this year, the opening of the NFL franchise tag and transition tag window. Now, every single year, it is a 2-week period that covers the NFL scouting combine as well. But the 2 of the 3 weeks leading up to free agency, every NFL team has the opportunity for one of their veteran players, someone who's not coming off, or someone who has an expiring contract, and Yeah, either it could be a player that they drafted 4 years ago, it could be just any sort of veteran on their team, a free agent signing, whatever the case may be. Any player can be franchise tagged, and each position that they're under, like the franchise tag value varies based off of the top salaries at those respective positions. So it is significantly more expensive to franchise tag a quarterback compared to a running back, for example. And those values have been determined, or they will be determined based off of what the official salary cap is, which is not yet known. The salary cap is projected to be about 303 million for the league wide, and then those franchise tag numbers will become official once that salary cap number becomes official. But when it comes to the Bengals, there's only one player, and everyone knows who he is, who could be franchise tagged this year, and it's Trey Hendrickson. Because for the second consecutive year, the Bengals have the most highly touted, highest ranked free agent, and that is Trey Hendrickson. Last year it was T. Higgins, and the Bengals did use the franchise tag on T. Higgins, but they used the franchise tag on T. Higgins to extend a window of negotiation to reach a long-term deal. And that's typically what the franchise tag is used for. Naturally, it is a leverage tactic that teams can use against players because, frankly, it is extremely non-player friendly. It's a vehicle that can deny a player free agency after he played out the duration of his original contract. And quite frankly, if the NFLPA had any sort of nuts, they would eventually negotiate this out, or if they even had the power to do so. Again, it's not very friendly towards the players, and it's completely friendly towards the team because it can prevent a guy like Trey Hendrickson from finally reaching free agency after he played 5 years for the Bengals. I know that the Bengals, if they do use the franchise tag on Trey Hendrickson, then they would not be using it to elongate a period in which to negotiate a long-term contract. If the Bengals wanted to sign Trey Hendrickson to a long-term contract, they would have done it last year. They certainly tried. And they realized that what Trey wants and what the Bengals want are two completely different things. Close to being the same. The difference is always what it usually is: the guaranteed money, the future guarantees. Trey is a year older. He's got one more injury attached to him. He's coming off of a not great year because he only played 7 games. The value in the Bengals' eyes of paying Trey Hendrickson the long-term contract that he wanted last year, coming off of his best season ever, doesn't exist anymore, or it doesn't exist at the same level that it did last year. Again, if they were going to pay him a long-term contract, it would have happened last year, and it didn't. So they kept the window open for him to be franchise tagged again this year by making sure that the 1-year pay raise that he signed in August last year, it did not include like a no tag clause. So the Bengals reserve the right to place the franchise tag on Trey Hendrickson to do as they see fit. Now, it could have been that if Trey was coming off of yet another really good year in 2025, the Bengals can tag Trey Hendrickson. It would be, I've just said that we don't know the franchise tag values for most positions yet. They're all projections, but we do know what it would be for Trey Hendrickson. It would be 120% of his salary of last year, and that equates to about $30.2 million in 2026 cap and cash. So Trey Hendrickson would get $30 million this year if he were to hypothetically play under the franchise tag in 2026. Total cap figure for him would be somewhere closer to 37 million, because not only would that 30 million be, again, both cash and cap on this year, but also the Bengals, the way that they structured his contract last year is that they put kind of like a void year in there to reduce the cap hit for 2025. And there's about $6.5 million of leftover cap dollars that goes into the 2026 cap sheet. So whether or not Trey Hendrickson is on the roster in 2026, the Bengals will be accounting for $6.5 million in terms of their cap space for Trey Hendrickson. So again, if they were to have the franchise tag on him this year, in terms of total cap dollars allocated towards one player, it would be about $37 million. And again, like, that's the math of the situation, but the logic of the situation says that if the Bengals are going to franchise tag Trey Hendrickson, they would use it to elongate not a negotiating window for his contract, but to elongate a negotiating window for a trade, a potential franchise tag, and then sign and trade to another team. Because the presumed outcome here is that Trey Hendrickson does play for another team in 2026. But the Bengals have the power, they have the right and the power to determine where he does play. And by placing the franchise tag on him, they remove him from the open market. And then they can enter negotiations. They can truly enter negotiations with teams that would have been interested in signing Trey as an unrestricted free agent. Now, just placing the franchise tag on Trey Hendrickson does not mean that Trey will sign it or that the $30 million in cap dollars immediately goes against the Bengals at that point. It becomes like assumed, right? If you want to do like the mental math there. But until Trey signs the franchise tag, it doesn't technically count against the cap for the Bengals. And that's good, right? T didn't sign the tag before he eventually signed his extension. So franchise tagging T Higgins didn't technically impact the Bengals in terms of what they did in free agency last year for that week between the beginning and when T eventually signed his extension along with Jamar Chase. So that is this whole situation. If the Bengals do end up franchise tagging Trey Hendrickson, it would be either A, because they, for whatever reason, feel like it is worth paying him $30 million this year and to have the majority of their cap space allocated towards one player for this year in this offseason, this player acquisition season, or B, it is to trade him leading up to or during the beginning of free agency. And they're going to go to the NFL scouting combine, according to the Inquirer's Kelsey Conway, to talk to other teams to see what the market is for Trey in terms of trade compensation. I would imagine that they're expecting a day 2 pick in return, which is frankly what they should have been after last year, but reports all said that they were targeting a first round pick, and that was never going to happen. If they were having the mindset of just accepting a second or third round pick for Trey last year, last offseason, he probably would have been already off the team. But at this point, that's probably the best that they could even remotely hope for. If they are, and I don't want to get too ahead of myself because I don't want to ruin the next segment, but that is the whole situation right now. It's these next 2 weeks. The Bengals can tag Trey at any moment. And if they don't tag Trey Hendrickson, then they cannot trade him. He would enter free agency unless the Bengals miraculously are able to get him to agree to a contract extension, and then he wouldn't free agency at all. So that is the situation there. Other news, apparently, according to Bengals Talk, a phenomenal Twitter account that covers the Bengals from a variety of different angles, Jalen Davis, the Bengals starting slot cornerback of the last 6 or 7 weeks of the 2025 season, has apparently signed an extension. Now, this is not official at all. I'm not breaking any news here, but Davis posted to his Instagram that it was basically, it's just a graphic of the word extended over like him in a Bengals uniform, and doesn't look to be in like an official team graphic that was posted by the Bengals or anything like that. May have been posted by his may have been made by his representation, but Jalen Davis is putting it out to the ether, to social media, that he has signed a contract extension, or he's at least agreed to a contract extension with the Bengals. And this is a really good move. I just wrote about Jalen Davis earlier today, which you can find on Z Sports Cincinnati, about how this is like the easiest decision the Bengals can make on the defensive side of the ball before free agency. Aside from what they do with Trey Hendrickson, there is no other free agent on the Bengals defense that makes the most sense to come back than Davis. Not only because he proved himself a capable starter in the last third of the 2025 season, but also that he's going to be presumably very cheap. He's never signed anything more than a 2-year minimum deal, which was a couple years ago. He only played 1 year of that deal before getting cut and then going back down to the practice squad. But he has been living off of these 1-year minimum deals as someone who was not drafted back in like 2018 or 2019. He joined the Bengals originally as a practice squad player in the middle of the COVID 2020 season, but he's been with the team for longer than any other player on their defense. And I know that's very shocking, but because the likes of Sam Hubbard and others are no longer there, it's been Jalen Davis as the longest tenured player for the Bengals defense. Longer than Trey Hendrickson, longer than BJ Hill, longer than any other cornerback or safety on the team. Jalen Davis has stuck it out in Cincinnati on both the practice squad and as a reserve on the active roster, as mainly a special teams guy. He backed up Mike Hilton for many years in the slot. And then when the opportunity came, when the Bengals needed another starter, when they had Dax Hill in the slot, and then Cam Taylor-Britt went out with a Linz Frank injury, a foot injury that ended his season in like week 11 or 12, Dax Hill was moved to the outside. He ended up being really good on the outside, but they needed someone to replace him in the slot. And they, instead of just turning to last year or 2024's fifth round pick, Josh Newton, they called up Jalen Davis from the practice squad for a handful of weeks, and he played really well in those times when she was just a practice squad standard elevation, and you can be elevated up to 3 times during the regular season. And at that point, after the 3 elevations were expired, they signed Jalen Davis to the active roster. And that was not the first time that this has happened, but he played so well that it seemed like entering the offseason, he looks to be like the penciled in starter as the Bengals slot defender, a position that's only growing more important in today's NFL. Now you're seeing guys like Kyle Hamilton and Nicky Manwari for the Seattle Seahawks kind of man that role as these big safeties that can kind of come down to the box. Jalen Davis is more that traditional size slot cornerback that may have some limitations, but he's still, I think, 29. I think he's going to be 30 this year and doesn't look to be slowing down athletically, but again, played really well in his first time in Al Golden's scheme. And for a defense that needs as little question marks as possible, knowing that they're going to sign multiple guys in free agency and they're going to draft as well to fill some other positions, having just a stable, known commodity at that position, feeling comfortable with Dax on the outside along with DJ Turner, they're both entering contract years. I think this is a great move. Because I don't think that Jalen Davis is breaking the bank by any means. I think the fact that he agreed to an extension in the middle of February definitely indicates that the Bengals got the price that they wanted out of this. This is not official. This is just based off of what Jalen Davis posted to Instagram. What looks to be a very official looking graphic here. I'm going to pull it up. Actually, I'm going to share my screen here so the audience here can view it. But yeah, there you go. Jalen Davis extended apparently. Again, don't know how legitimate this is. I don't know if he just kind of jumped the gun here, but if he was actually signed, if he actually put pen to paper, then the Bengals would officially announce it with a picture and a graphic of their own. But according to Jalen Davis on Instagram, he has been extended by the Cincinnati Bengals. And that is a move that they should have made this offseason. It's one of the easiest moves that they could have made, just bringing back a stable, consistent player who played well as a starter. And if he's not going to be a starter, he's going to be a fine backup and a special teamer. He's not going to cost a lot. It made a lot of sense. It's why it was an easy decision. It's why it was a decision that they should have made. Now, what about the moves that the Bengals shouldn't make? What are the moves that the Bengals should avoid making this offseason? I think the best place to start here is, of course, with Trey Hendrickson. Because what I didn't want to touch on is the downside, or the, I guess, rather negative outcomes that could come with Trey Hendrickson. Negative outcomes that, honest to God, I could see this team doing. I could see disaster scenarios in which Trey Hendrickson is either still with the Bengals and not practicing, maybe not even playing, or he does play, doesn't present the value of being a $30 million player, whatever the case may be, right? The worst thing the Bengals could do with Trey Hendrickson is place the franchise tag on him, thinking that they're going to get compensation in the form of like a draft pick or two in return, and then realizing when it comes time to actually iron out this trade in the days leading up to free agency, they can't get a deal. They can't get a trade. They can't get the price that they're looking for. Whether they're pushing for a price that's more than what teams are willing to pay, or maybe the worst case scenario, the teams that they targeted as likely destinations, as likely trade landing spots for Trey, end up signing other players, other defensive ends, other pass rushers in free agency, and therefore taking themselves out of the market. Excuse me. That is the worst case scenario. The worst case is hitching yourself to Trey Hendrickson, placing the franchise tag on him, even if he doesn't sign it, and then free agency begins, and the teams that were initially looking to trade for him no longer want to trade for him and would rather sign an unrestricted free agent who they don't have to give up a draft pick for. The worst thing that they can do is to be stuck with Trey Hendrickson on a $30 million cap hit that cannot be adjusted, knowing damn well that he is not going to sign an extension with you. and being married to that, being hitched to that, not getting any compensation for him this year, knowing that he's going to be on the roster in 2026. So the earliest that he could leave is 2027, and then you wouldn't be able to get a compensatory pick for him until 2028. That cannot happen. It cannot happen. And I could see it happen, though. I really, in my most pessimistic parts of my brain, I could see the Bengals tagging Trey Hendrickson with the belief that they can get a trade done and not being able to figure out that trade in time before other defensive ends start going off the board, before other teams in need of defensive ends start looking elsewhere, or the Bengals thinking that they can get themselves a compensation package that they would deem like, oh, we definitely won this trade. We are trading away a 4-time Pro Bowler, an All-Pro, a Defensive Player of the Year runner-up. We deserve, at the very least, like a top 50 or even a first-round pick still. And teams were just like, no, this is ridiculous. This is not, like, we're not going to let you swindle any one of us. If you're going to tag trade and you're going to prop him up as a player that is worth whatever sort of draft pick that you're after, whether it be a first or a high second, then that's the bet you made. That's why you tagged him, right? It cannot happen. It cannot happen. The Bengals cannot tag Trey and have him play out on the tag. It is the worst move that they can make. The only way it could kind of be salvageable is if the Bengals do something that they've never done before. And that would be restructuring Joe Burrow's deal and clearing up cap space in order to better absorb the $30 million cap hit that, again, cannot be touched with, cannot be tampered with, cannot be adjusted with a void year here and there. Clearing up about $20-ish million worth of cap space is what they could do if they were to move around some of Joe Burrow's money. The Bengals have made pay cuts. They forced players, to make pay cuts in the past, like Joe Mixon for one, Geno Stone last year, right? Zach Moss last year, even though he eventually got cut for real. The Bengals have never actually restructured a contract, though, and that's a common misconception. I think it's a misnomer amongst a lot of fans. They think that a pay cut is restructured. No, a contract restructure is when essentially money gets moved around in a deal, but no money is taken out of the deal. It's essentially giving players a lot of cash up front in the form of a signing bonus that they would normally get paid out, whether in salary for this year or salary in the next year, whatever the case may be. But when you put money into the form of a signing bonus, that signing bonus can then be prorated over the course of the remaining life of the deal. So therefore, because of that proration, even though you get a lot of cash, the cap hit for this year is minimized because of the proration. Instead of having this giant salary that you have to pay and that all goes onto the current cap, you can convert that salary into a signing bonus. If they were to do that with Joe Burrow, they would clear up about $20 million in cap space, which I honestly, like, it's not the worst idea to do this year anyways, regardless of what happens with Trey. But I think in just the mind of a Bengals fan, you think the only way that they're going to do something progressive like that is in order to counter out something that they shouldn't have done, or just a major mistake, and which would be tagging Trey without actually trading him. So that is like the biggest first mistake, and really like the headline, honestly. And it's kind of good that they're getting this out of the way, or they're just addressing this head on. They're just going to have to deal with this before free agency all happens. And I think the next overall thing, it still involves Trey, but it just kind of comes down a little bit later, is if they trade Trey, is that they end up going to get the deal that they want, whether it's a third-round pick, maybe by some luck, it's like a late second-round pick, but probably like a third-round pick, right? I think the Bengals would take a third-round pick for Trey Hendrickson in a tag-and-trade situation. It's no guarantee, though, that they get that deal in the wee hours of free agency, or it's agreed upon before free agency even begins. And that's the best-case scenario, right? Because knowing the Bengals, if they don't know that they're going to be able to trade Trey, they're going to want to hold on to their money as much as possible because they need their beloved cap space. They need their 15 to 20 million in cap space before the draft even arrives. If they tag Trey, they're all the way down to just 24 million in cap space at that point. They're at about 53 to 54 million dollars in cap space right now. without cutting anyone. I don't expect them to really cut anyone of significance or importance outside of maybe like Warren Burks. So the Bengals will hold on to their cap spaces as much as they can, knowing that we may have to pay Trey $30 million in cap space. L'Jarius Sneed was the last player to get tagged and traded. And he was traded, I believe, almost 2 weeks after free agency began. The Chiefs traded him to the Tennessee Titans for like a third round pick, I want to say. It was at the top of the third round. And if the Bengals found themselves in that position, I could absolutely see themselves sitting on their hands and trying to find these bargain bin value deals that don't affect the cap that much and don't eat up into the space that they feel like they always have to have. That is another bad scenario. That's another thing that they shouldn't do. If you feel like you can't trade Trey in a timely manner, and therefore you would have to sit out of the free agent, of the part of the free agency that you need to participate in actively, then you shouldn't even bother with this. Just trading Trey eventually for a third round pick is not worth it if it takes you out of being able to sign the players that you need to sign, regardless if you trade Trey or not. And the only reason why I really bring this up is because this is basically what happened last year. The Bengals should have done so much more in free agency in 2025 beyond signing Oren Burks, Samaje Perine, and TJ Sladen to these 2-year deals. They needed more help. They needed another pass rusher. They needed a guard earlier than Lucas freaking Patrick in the second week, but they didn't. Like Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and almost all of Friday passed without basically anything happening because behind the scenes they were focused on trying to extend Jamar Chase and T. Higgins to these contracts that should have been signed months, if not years ago, for T at least. That's the reality here. Like they are so understaffed relative to everyone else in the league, and they rely on the biggest players of that front office to handle these deals. And they don't trust anyone else in there to basically fill out the rest of the team. Like Duke Tobin was so busy trying to negotiate with T and Jamar that like who's out there in the heart of free agency trying to make the team better? They apparently just didn't have the bandwidth to do it. It was ridiculous. Who's to say that something similar wouldn't happen if they were trying to negotiate a trade with Trey Hendrickson with all these teams? It's the same thing. It's just a different type of negotiation, but it's a negotiation that I know can get really stingy with them specifically because they always want to win the trade. And that's why I'm not 100% on board with them trading Trey or trying to trade him in the first place. I don't know if they can get this done in a timely manner. But number one, they should not tag Trey Hendrickson with the intent of keeping him in 2026. And number two, if they are going to trade Trey, they cannot wait to do it. They cannot let the negotiations of trading Trey Hendrickson prohibit them from signing the players that they need to sign in the early hours, the early parts of free agency. Can't happen. As far as overall free agency, though, I don't really have a lot of avoids necessarily in terms of players. I'm sure we can go through a list and I can say hey, for this price, I wouldn't target this guy. But if the Bengals try to make a big swing, whether it be this uncharacteristic trade for Max Crosby or Jeffrey Simmons, or if they sign one of the top free agents, if they feel like that guy fits their culture, their locker room, their scheme, all that stuff, yada, 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 right? If they happen to take a big swing on a player that fits a position of need, I'm not going to chastise them for them. I'll praise them for it, honestly. I think anything, excuse me, I think anything along those lines would send a needed surge of energy towards the team, towards the fan base, right? Like, can you imagine how hype everyone would be if all of a sudden Max Crosby walks through that door? It'd be insane. It'd be such a signal that, this team is serious. That's kind of the same sort of energy that was felt in 2020 and 2021. When DJ Reader signed out of nowhere, seemingly, when the whole world was shutting down with COVID, and you had no idea what the Bengals were going to do, you kind of felt that they were going to continue sticking in their old ways. And then they brought in a really high quality free agent that you knew was going to not only make the team better on the field, but also he knew he was going to set the tone at practice and in the locker room. It's this, hell yeah. I don't know if this is going to work out, but like, okay, you did something, right? The Bengals haven't really done that in a couple of years. Orlando Brown was, I guess, really the biggest swing that they did. And other than that, it was Sheldon Rankins, which kind of came a couple days, into free agency and was only really necessary because they allowed DJ Reader to leave for the Detroit Lions. And then we all saw what Rankins ended up being for Cincinnati. He was just trying to fit like a square peg into a round hole. But I'm not going to like really, berate them for signing guys that they feel like are fits, right? I'm sure, if a scenario were to unfold in which a player is just grossly overpaid, like a Trey Wayne situation, right? Like that would be a scenario in which, yeah, like they should probably avoid that. Like there are levels to how smart and how unwise these decisions could be. But in general, free agency, like be aggressive. More importantly, though, fill your needs. Do your best to fill your needs. And don't sit on your hands waiting for value to come to you. That's honestly the biggest thing for free agency. In 2022 and in 2021, really, the Bengals did not sign the most expensive players. They never really do, right? But you would think naturally in free agency, like the most expensive players get signed first, and then like the mid-tier players go, and then the value deals, the bargain bin deals, the players that you expect the Bengals to get, they go after that. It's not always the case. I think a problem in the past couple of years, in 2023 especially, and in last year, is that a bunch of players that kind of fit like the best case scenario for the Bengals, like those mid-market guys who are entering their second contracts, but they're not going to get paid at the top of the market. Those guys end up going off the board earlier than you expect. And sometimes, yeah, they end up getting paid a little bit more than you expect. But in 2022, the Bengals immediately went to work signing Alex Kappa, signing Ted Karras. In 2021, they didn't mess around. Like they signed Trey Hendrickson that first day. They were trying to negotiate with Carl Lawson at the same time. But Chidobe Awuzie, Mike Hilton, like they were pretty early signings in that free agency period as well. They attacked value early. They didn't wait around to see who was left and then just woo them with the leverage of, hey, like this is a decent deal. And we got Joe Burrow, let's ride. No, they attacked early. And they started doing that, at least in the beginning last year with, if TJ Slayton and Oren Burks and Samaje Perine were just the start of a productive full week of free agency, it would have looked a lot better. But those became just the guys, right? The Bengals stopped. That can't happen either, right? They can't just have one day of free agency and just call it quits and just allow themselves to have so many holes entering the draft. And that is, I think, the final one, right? Don't leave your biggest weakness, your biggest hole on the roster open for the draft. Just because you have a top 10 pick, you need that 10th pick to not only be a good player, but a franchise cornerstone, right? Hopefully for the Bengals, you're not drafting the top 10 very often. And even though this is a relatively weak class, at least it looks like on paper, in terms of high-end talent, you cannot go into the draft expecting the answer to your final problem to be available to you. The word, like in terms of the draft, right? The Bengals hoping and praying that like Caleb Downs is there after they didn't sign a safety, that is a huge red flag. That is something that absolutely should be avoided. The Bengals cannot enter the draft after not signing a safety or a defensive tackle or a defensive end. Those three positions specifically should all be addressed before the draft even gets there. But in typical Bengals fashion, there's the fear that at least one of them will be open. And the argument will be, well, we have the 10th overall pick, and we'll just fill that need with that pick, regardless if that player is worth that pick. Sometimes it works out, right? But in 2021, basically all their needs were filled except wide receiver, right? People forget that the Bengals' other starter at wide receiver entering the draft on opposite of T. Higgins was Mike Thomas. Mike Thomas was the Bengals starting boundary receiver, Tyler Boyd in the slot. It was Mike Thomas, T. Higgins, and Tyler Boyd as the penciled-in starters for the Bengals entering the 2021 draft. It shouldn't have been a shock at all that Jamar Chase ended up being the pick. They telegraphed it from the beginning. 2018. Remember, Frank Ragnow is the guy. The Bengals didn't sign a center. They left that position open as the rest of the offensive line was being built around it. They didn't have any glaring needs necessarily anywhere else. Center was the need for the Bengals that year. And Frank Ragnow gets swiped right in front of them, and they panic and pick Billy Price. Light that pick on fire. Sometimes it works with Jamar Chase because you pick 5th overall and you have pretty high confidence he's going to be there. Sometimes it doesn't when you pick 21st. Just because you pick 10th and you're in the top 10 does not mean you should feel comfortable that the answer to your biggest glaring need is going to be there. And hell, the Bengals had multiple needs entering the draft last year. And that's why the first 3 rounds went the way that they did. Because they picked the top player on their board in the first round, Shamar Stewart. And then they entered day 2 knowing that they needed a linebacker and they needed a guard. And then Al Golden won in the second round over Scott Peters, who obviously had eyes for Tate Rutledge. And they picked Demetrius Knight because he was their top linebacker on the board, even though consensus-wise, he was not expected to be picked until a round later. And then round 3 came around, and Scott Peters was like, okay, well, you got your linebacker. I need my guard. And Dylan Fairchild was the pick. And it worked out, right? It is a dangerous flip of the coin to draft for need and to set yourself up to have to draft for need. Can't happen. Handle business with Trey before free agency begins. Do not let trade negotiations prevent you from targeting who you need to target in free agency. Do not sit on your hands at the start of free agency and hoping value comes to you. Attack the value at the beginning and keep peppering your roster with quality signings. You don't have to swing hardest. You don't have to hit grand slams here. Just hit a bunch of singles and doubles. Fill out your defense with quality players. Sign them early. And do not exit free agency and enter the draft with a glaring need that you expect can be filled with the 10th overall pick. If the Bengals avoid those things, this may be a successful offseason. They don't even have to change any of their principles necessarily with the contracts. Just don't sit on your hands, essentially. Be aggressive, be attacking, enter the draft feeling good. I do want to get to some questions here. Lindsey Brill, that there's not a strong backup quarterback in case Joe can't come back. There should be someone under Joe's learning. That's my frustration. It's a valid frustration, I think. And the Bengals haven't drafted a quarterback since Joe Burrow. I feel like that's a little bit surprising. But, Jake Browning has been there for 4 years now, since 2021. And he was just a practice squad signing at the beginning of the 2021 season. I think they will try to re-sign Joe Flacco. I do. But I don't think that they will be lucky in doing so before free agency begins. I think he will survey his options, and I think if he does get an opportunity to sign to a place that doesn't have a stable answer and that therefore he can have some playing time, I think he will end up going that route. But I do think the Bengals will try to re-sign Joe Flacco, and if they can't, then maybe with a pick that they get from Trey Hendrickson, maybe that becomes a quarterback in the draft. Zach Bednarik 9386 odds you think they'll do their correct thing and tag and trade him feels slim. Yeah, it does naturally feel slim because it's something that they've never done before, and I think that's always the case with the Bengals. Until they actually break precedent, you don't feel comfortable expecting it outside of situations in which they don't have a choice. They still do have a choice though with Trey, and they may feel like, oh, if we can't get a 3rd round pick for him this year, if the best that we can do is a 5th, then we will take our chances, let him walk, and take the 3rd or 4th rounder next year. But of course, that depends on what they do in free agency this year. If they lose more than they gain in free agency, they would be set up for a compensatory pick. But they're not on track to do that, right? They don't have as many free agents that are going to be attractive to other teams. Like Joe Flacco is one for sure. I think Joseph Ossai has a good chance of landing a contract worthy or that could then be inputted into the compensatory pick formula. The contracts that your players sign from other teams have to be large enough. That to be one of the 32 largest contracts that are signed in free agency. There's only 32 or something in that range of compensatory picks that are awarded each year. And if the Bengals expect to get a third round pick from Trey Hendrickson, then they also can't sign a player that has as large that will sign as large or even larger in terms of compensation than Trey. So they're already not really going to play in those waters anyways. I think Trey is projected to be anywhere in like the 25 to $30 million range, or maybe even more, right? For whatever deal he ends up signing. I think it will be smaller if it ends up being a tag and trade, but if he does hit the open market, then, obviously teams negotiating for him are just going to raise the price up. So yeah, I really do think that they will try, because they probably have the inkling that we may not be in a position to get a compensatory pick next year because of the way the free agency is going to go. But it does require them to do something that they've never done. Joshua Masters 1836, idealistic realistic move. I'm having trouble reading. Tag Trey, trade him to the NFC along with the 6th and 7th round picks, get a 3rd and 5th in return. I'm on board with it, right? The Bengals gave up their 5th round pick in order to get Joe Flacco, so they have an extra 6th, I believe. They got a 7th for Logan Wilson, so they do have a quote unquote abundance in late day 3 picks in order to get this. Getting 2 picks in return, getting 2 picks in the first 5 rounds in return for Trey Hendrickson, I think that's a phenomenal scenario, right? This is basically the same compensation as a 2nd round pick. And if you get a 2nd round pick for Trey and a tag and trade, sign me up easily. Let's see, anything else? I do like this. Last year they signed TJ Slaton, and that was it, basically. Because again, I don't know if Warren Burks is really going to be on this team. He just didn't play well enough to warrant having a role that he did last year. Special teams wise, I think he's fine. And if that's what you want for $2.7 million, then so be it. But the Bengals shouldn't feel very comfortable at linebacker at all. And knowing that they're going to be targeting a veteran to start alongside either Barrett Carter or Demetrius Knight, that was supposed to be Warren Burks, right? He was supposed to be someone that can play needed snaps in case something happens, which it did, right? Demetrius Knight struggled immensely in the middle of his rookie season, and Warren Burks just wasn't the answer in terms of replacing him. So, like, you had this weird rotation with Burks and Knight playing, and neither one was playing well. And Barrett Carter was struggling. It was the worst. It was the worst linebacker room in the NFL last year, bar none. That's why they have to do something with it. They're going to give Knight and Carter more chances this year, but yeah, Warren Burks is like one of their quote unquote biggest signings, and he ended up being a total bust. But I don't think it was just TJ Slaton though, because Samaje Perine was decent. But again, if TJ Slaton and Samaje Perine if those guys are your top free agents, then you definitely have an issue. Let's do one more. Ronald Schilling. I wouldn't have given BJ Hill a contract over Trey. Yeah, I mean, the reason why they gave it to Hill is because Hill didn't mind that the guaranteed money was all in year one. Like that, if you accept that, if you're okay with that, if you're okay with 50% of your contract being in year one, and then after that it's just a year-to-year thing, the Bengals would love to pay you. They would love to pay you your market value. They tried to give Trey what they deemed to be his market value, but just a play-by-year type of situation. That's what BJ Hill is on right now, and that's why BJ Hill is considered a cap cut this year. If the Bengals decide that they want to completely upgrade the defensive tackle room, they can move on from BJ Hill and not be penalized in terms of their cap space because the way that contract is structured. Trey didn't want to do that, right? Naturally, because if Trey has the season that he had in 2025 and then he enters 2026 without any guaranteed money to protect him, he could be cut. This is the exact scenario that Trey tried to prevent, and that's why he held out until August 28th or whatever the day was, 25th. But that's why BJ Hill is here, because he chose to accept the Bengal structure. But I think that's all the time we have for. We went for 45 minutes talking about some negative things. All that's out there. All of that is out. Expectations have been set. What the Bengals shouldn't do in the 2026 offseason. It's going to be a very interesting 2 months, though. Because if the Bengals avoid all these steps, if they avoid all these problems, I really do feel like this can be a productive offseason. And by God, Do they need that? We'll see what happens, though. First things first, internal moves such as potentially Jalen Davis being extended by the Cincinnati Bengals, potentially Trey Hendrickson receiving the franchise tag sometime in the next 2 weeks. We'll see what happens. We'll be back next week talking a lot about the NFL scouting combine, what to expect. We're going to hear from Duke Tobin and Zach Taylor a little bit more at the end of next week. We'll talk about that in a couple shows from now. But until then, see you next time.